I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm running the game and the monitor in HDR. So the monitor will accept an HDR10, respond to an HDR10 colour signal. Your options are very limited under HDR on the monitor. So there's ASUS Gaming HDR, ASUS Cinema HDR, ASUS Console HDR and Brightness Adjustable. Whichever of these modes you choose, Brightness Adjustable by the way is a toggle which you can activate on top of any of these modes. The image is exactly the same, or was on my unit, regardless of what you select here. That could depend on firmware, could potentially depend on your GPU or your system as well. But I tested with an RTX 3090 via HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4 and it was exactly the same. At the time I'm doing this video, I haven't done any testing with my AMD GPU, but I will make observations using my AMD GPU in the vision review as well, so check that just in case there are any changes. But hopefully it's a very consistent experience with HDR on the AMD and NVIDIA side. Generally it is. And this isn't one of those monitors that has AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, which can give you a different HDR pipeline if you're using an AMD graphics card with FreeSync enabled. So you don't have to worry about that kind of possible inconsistency there. But you can actually use VRR on this monitor on the AMD or NVIDIA side at the same time as HDR. So if you enable the brightness adjustable toggle, that actually tells you HDR PQ curve will be affected when the brightness adjustment is on under HDR mode. So this will just unlock your brightness control. If you reduce that at all below 100, then you're affecting that PQ curve. Really things are optimized to run at a brightness of 100 under HDR, and that's what it would be if you have this slider disabled, so you haven't selected that little checkbox. If you reduce it below that, then things tend to just look sort of washed out. You don't get the kind of dynamic range you should. It just drags things down and eventually it sort of muddies things. It's almost like the gamma's messed up under SDR if you were doing this under SDR. It really is just optimized and tuned for this to be set at 100. But if you find that too bright and it's just unbearable for you and you need to reduce the brightness, then that's what that option is for. Other setting of note, color temperature, two options here, 6500K and 8200K. The actual color temperature does depend on the brightness and can depend on the content that you're looking at, but on my unit, the 6500K setting was certainly closer to that. It was a little bit above. I measured 6700, I think it was. But for the 8200K, I measured even above that. I think it was 8700K. So that is a very cool white point. Gives a very bluish look to things, and that can accelerate visual fatigue. It could be uncomfortable for some users, so I really wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend sticking to the 6500K. But the reason you might want to use the other option is because it does increase the brightness a little bit. So I'm just going to show you some figures on the screen and I'll run through what this monitor is capable of when it comes to brightness under HDR. So the blue line here is using that 8200K setting, the green line the 6500K setting, and the orange line is the Dell Alienware AW3423DW to represent the QD OLED ultrawides, just for comparison. Now you can see that even using the 6500K setting, the peak luminance recorded was 926 nits, which is actually pretty good. That's not too far below 1000 nits, which is specified or claimed for this model. And the 8200K setting allowed it to go above that, closer to 1100 nits. I measured 1092, but you know, pretty close to that. So you'll see that really the differences in brightness here aren't dramatic between the two modes, and it generally outperforms the QD OLED a little bit. And depending on the setting you use, it might be a little bit brighter or a little bit dimmer than the QD OLED. But the brightness does heavily depend on all monitors and in all modes on the white patch size, which is the x-axis there, 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% or 100%. For those who aren't aware, you have a white square in the middle of the screen surrounded by pure black, and the size of the white square either covers 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49 or 100% of pixels. So with 100% you don't get any black on the screen, that's a full white screen, and this is actually a sustained reading for 100%. The rest are peak readings, but actually the peak and sustained for most of these, particularly the smaller patch sizes, very similar anyway, so you don't really have to worry about that. With all this in mind, I wouldn't really recommend the 8200K setting for reasons I mentioned before, and the fact that the brightness, yes it is a bit higher, but this isn't really a dramatic difference. And I did actually compare the Alienware side by side with this model. I did some testing. Unfortunately, I can't show you videos of that testing, although there's no point, because it really isn't something which can be accurately represented. I even took some footage in HDR to see if I could show some differences, but it wasn't possible, so it's not something I'm going to include. but really the overall brightness experience I found largely similar between them. You can see that the Alienware did drop a bit more at 9% patch size in comparison to this ASUS, but it had a bit of a brightness advantage for 100% sustained and 49%, so where bright shades dominate, but really you can see a huge drop on both models if you're looking at brighter shades dominating on the screen, and again I will explore that subjectively to give you more of an idea of what that might look like in game. Another advantage under HDR is that the monitor is using 10-bit color processing, and that's used by the game content as well, and that gives you an enhanced nuanced shade variety. It also allows the monitor to more accurately tone map and also put its gamut to good use. So it's very useful under HDR. It's really an important part of the whole sort of look under HDR. It does increase the nuanced shade variety, these dark shades, and with the per pixel illumination it really sort of marries together really well here. So I don't know what this will look like on the video, but the dark cracks in the rocks there are extremely deep, and there are some just very slightly brighter shades right next to it. Just a really lovely variety of very dark shades here. And the medium shades have good depth to them as well. The bright crosshair there's no haloing or anything like that to worry about, no blooming, just an immediate transition between the white and the essentially black surrounding it, or the very dark shades and the very light shades, the combinations. And the HUD elements there, the same thing. They can be nice and bright, whereas immediately surrounding that can just shut off the pixels or have them much dimmer. So no haloing or blooming to worry about as you get with mini LED solutions. I'm now on Cyberpunk 2077, running the game under HDR again. I am just going to flick between various different games and scenes, so I'm sorry if that's a bit disorienting, but it just helps me increase the sort of range of scenes I show and talk about. So with this scene here, this is one I used on the AW3423DW to talk about the automatic brightness limiter, and I showed you that with the graph as well. You could see that when bright shades dominate, the screen does dim. It won't come across properly in the video, but just sort of be aware of what I'm saying. If you compare that to that, the bright shades there are very bright indeed, really lovely natural look to the daylight there. There it's maintained a little bit, but there's a bit of dimming, and where the bright shades really dominate, it just dims quite significantly. And it's not just the bright shades, you can actually see shifts when you look at the HUD element, so that little man down there, or the character down there. And I've actually got most of the HUD elements turned off because I was just doing some photos on this game before. There you go, I've got my HUD elements back so you can see the map, you can see other things, draw weapon, and you can see the shifts more readily there. You can see them with the HUD elements, I can see them anyway. I'm not sure how it'll look on the video, I'm afraid the camera will be compensating for the shifts. But they are there, and certainly this is dimmer than that. And you can see it with the grey shades on the pavement as well, the shifts, because it's not just the bright shades, it's a sort of whole screen shift. The reason OLEDs do this is power limitations. It can't display the same brightness that it's showing there for the bright shades if that's shown everywhere on the screen, because that would require more power. So it's a power limitation, which OLEDs do have. And as I showed with the graph, it is a bit less aggressive than on the QD OLED models, so I can see more of the brightness on the screen at the same time before it'll start dimming. I mean, that is nice, but I still notice the dimming, and certainly for bright dominant scenes, I do feel that they're just less impressive than scenes where there was sort of bright highlight or just smaller areas of bright shade on the screen, more mixed content really, with some good sort of darker areas as well. And that's exactly what you get in this scene at night. It's exactly the same scene, just at night instead of in the day. Really nice bright look to the moon there. It's not as bright as I've seen on some of the mini LED models, and I'm just going to change the exposure of the camera again just to show you it's not a giant ball of brightness. You can actually see the distinct detail of the moon as well. And even with the camera exposure changed a lot, it sort of doesn't really look like it does to the eye, but never mind. You just have to take my word for it. Pretty bright, but not as bright as I've seen on some of the mini LED solutions, similar to what I saw on the Alienware though. Same with this street lamp there as well, nice and bright, and the neon lights in the background, really nice brightness to them. Can pump out excellent brightness, and then it can keep the surrounding darker shades nice and deep. Although this particular game isn't the best for talking about that kind of thing, because it just naturally, because of the art direction, it doesn't really have the deepest dark shades. That's just how they've designed the game. But even so, there's still a lot of contrast here, and the monitor is able to immediately show very bright shades and much darker shades surrounding it. So the light there, for example, there isn't a haloing, which I'd usually see on mini LEDs for that particular light, and just really the smaller bright elements, the light up there as well. It just, the pixels around it can be immediately dark. And you will see some haloing naturally when you're looking at the game, but that's actually the game itself. It's not from the monitor, so there's no additional haloing from the monitor because of its per pixel illumination. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and this is a scene I like to show, particularly with mini LED monitors, because they show the scene very nicely. There's a certain luminosity to the sky, I love saying that. The brightness to the sun there, and the glints on the icy surface there. That is lost a bit in this case because of the automatic brightness limiter. The monitor is certainly not pumping out its maximum luminance levels for all of these bright elements, these little bright highlights here. And when I say little bright highlights, you'll notice that a lot of the screen often shows a lot of bright shade, and that's the issue. If I'm just showing you a little bit of bright shade like there, then actually the brightness is really impressive. But again, it's the brightness limiter when more of the bright shade is shown. So I'm not going to say too much more about this scene. I just wanted to include this in the rotation because I like to use this when I'm showing you mini LED solutions, and I often praise them there. But it isn't like things look completely dull or washed out, and it's just in comparison to what the mini LEDs can show here. And actually, this scene is a bit better than on the Alienware, and that's again because the monitor is able to pump out better brightness as bright shade starts to dominate. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again with HDR, and I'm going to stick to Tomb Raider for the rest of this section. The sun there, nice and bright, and lots of nice bright shade up there as well, and the 10-bit colour reproduction helps with the nuanced shade variety, so there are gentler progressions of shade, gentler gradients, smoother, more natural looking gradients. But this does depend on the game and actually the scene in the game. It is up to the developers to make good use of this, so it doesn't just automatically mean everything's going to look smooth and amazing. And it's also able to show nice depth there for the dark shades, the medium shades, good depth to them, and showing the bright shades at the same time. However, there is some peculiarity with how it shows these very bright shades. And this isn't specific to this game, it's actually a limitation with the technology used, and I have observed this on other games as well, by the way, and it's not an issue with HDR calibration either. It is actually physical limitation, and that's because of that pesky white subpixel, because the monitor's using that white subpixel at a very bright level, that unfiltered white subpixel, and that really dominates and sort of waters down, if you like, the colours. So that's really a much less technical way of saying it reduces the colour volume. So the monitor is pumping out a lot of pure unfiltered white light, whereas there's not so much light that's being filtered through the red, green and blue subpixels. So I can see for the glint of light here, really nice and bright, every bit as bright as on the Alienware, for example, but it doesn't look smooth. What you have is this sort of pure white core, then you have yellow surrounding it, then you have orange surrounding that. And that's really just because the monitor can't display this particular element as it should look, and that is just a warm white throughout, nicely blended, and that's how it looks like on the Alienware, how it would look like on mini LED monitors unless they have some other issue. Again, this isn't something you can notice or see in the video. It doesn't matter what I set the camera exposure to. You really can't see what I'm seeing by eye or what you can see by eye. This scene is a good example of this as well. The bright light there, really nice and bright, really eye-catching, just as good as it was on the Alienware. And I mean, technically the brightness can be higher on some of the mini LED models I've looked at, the ASUS PG27AQDM, for example, that can really reach incredible brightness, and that's even when bright shades dominate, not just when there's a little bright section like there is here. But the contrast here is really exceptional. So I look at that bright shade there, really nice dark shades in the background, and again a really nice nuanced shade variety, so I can see little details with the brickwork there as well, or the stonework. So the little details are there, but some of the dark shades are exceptionally deep and inky. Just the immediate transitions between the two as well. Really nice, lovely per pixel illumination doing its thing there. But when I look at this, and again you can't see this in the video, this should look a blended cool white with a little bit of a sort of bluish purple quality to it. Whereas here you get a white core, and surrounding that you get this kind of silvery bluish purple ring. It looks like a kind of posterization effect, and this is again just because it can't show bright saturated shades. It can only show brightness and saturation separately. Really odd. You know, it's not something that everyone's going to necessarily notice when they're just playing a game. It's something that my keen eye for colour does notice, I was drawn into, and I am aware of this technical limitation as well, so I was kind of looking out for it, to be honest. another scene which highlights this. I know this is going to get a little bit repetitive because you're again not going to be able to see this in the video, but I'm just going to talk you through it. So there are some really nice rich reds, and I will talk about colour reproduction using another scene a little bit later on, but yeah, there are some nice rich red hues. The colour gamut really is helpful here. And there's some pretty bright looking shades as well. But when I look at the brightest shades that are being displayed, but where the monitor's again trying to ideally be showing extreme brightness and saturation, like here, this will just look like a giant ball of light really on the video. But to the eye, the lava here has a sort of quite a flat look really, the flowing lava, sort of bright but pinkish. And the flames there have that posterization effect again with a white core surrounded by less bright yellow and orange, where what you should be able to see is you should be able to see stripes of brightness, stripes of intensely saturated orange and red and yellow as well. It should just look more blended, everything going at the same time, and that's how it looks on the QD OLEDs and the mini LED solutions for that matter. But this monitor just can't show both at the same time. Again, a WOLED limitation. I'm back on the scene I showed you when I was talking about contrast, and this is a scene which I usually find a bit less impressive, well, quite a bit less impressive actually, on mini LED solutions, and that's because the game is telling the monitor, so to speak, that there's supposed to be a very deep look to a lot of these dark shades here, really extreme depth, but there are still actually some little details which are supposed to be brought out. With mini LED solutions, they aren't able to do that. They have to dark bias to make sure the depth of those dark shades are good, which really dulls down some of the sort of dark to medium shades, the skulls, the bones that are shown here. You won't be able to see them in the video because it's extremely dark, and again this is the nuanced shade variety coming into play here. You get some very slightly brighter but still dark shades. They're all displayed very nicely here. I mean, overall I think they're displayed nicely here, certainly compared to the mini LED solutions where you just get that loss of detail because of the dark biasing. Alternatively, they could bright bias, but then you'd get the visibility, but you don't get the same depth of the dark shades. The per pixel illumination allows this monitor to achieve both of those things. Really nice. And good brightness as well when I draw the bow here in the middle and around the torch, and the HUD elements that come up there. Even with the very dark shades surrounding it, there's no haloing, no blooming. Again, the per pixel illumination doing its thing. So I just wanted to include this scene as well, just because I showed you it with contrast, and it really does look very impressive on this monitor under HDR. I'm on a different scene, and I'm going to focus more on the colour reproduction side of things. So I kind of talked about that with the white subpixel, but a lot of the shades that you'll see under HDR, they're not going to be those brightly saturated shades. You're going to get some colourful elements like the leaves here, Laura's dress there, and the colour gamut is put to really good use here. And unlike under SDR, the developers are actually targeting wider colour spaces, DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020, and the monitor doesn't offer full Rec 2020 coverage, but it offers nearly full DCI-P3 coverage, so some encroachment into Rec 2020. Not as much as the QD OLED models, so I do notice that the green shades here look a little bit more lush and vibrant on the QD OLED, and yes, there are some screen surface differences which can kind of come into play perceptively there, but it's really, the colour gamut isn't as wide on this model, and certainly I've seen a lusher look to these green shades on some of the mini LED solutions like the ASUS PG27AQDM. Really generous gamut there in the green to blue region. But I would not describe what this monitor is showing as anything other than vibrant. Still is really nice lush look and really nice variety to the greens, and because the wide colour gamuts like this are being targeted, Laura's skin looks neutral, looks as it should. It doesn't look overdone. She doesn't look too tanned as she does under SDR. The little fire there as well doesn't have the kind of reddish push to the oranges. Just nice vibrant oranges and yellows as it should appear. The earthy browns as well, more neutral. There's not that red push I was talking about before. I know I was showing you Battlefield, but exactly the same thing applies. So overall, really a nice HDR experience. It is a shame about that white subpixel. Because of this, I was left a bit less impressed than I was on the QD OLED monitor, but I do still think it offers a rich and dynamic HDR experience. Shows a good level of vibrancy, and it shows some really nice bright elements, and it can sustain decent brightness levels where bright shades start to dominate. Of course, when they completely dominate, yes, the ABL kicks in. Again, though it's a little bit less aggressive than on the QD OLED, so that could be considered an advantage on this monitor in comparison. And actually the overall brightness levels, really I think ASUS has pushed this panel very well in that respect. I haven't yet reviewed any of the others myself, such as the LG 27GR95QE, but I will be doing that shortly. So of course I will be comparing and taking figures using the same methodology so we can compare, because this ASUS monitor with its heat sink, that should offer some improvements to its brightness capability.